The Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries to natural disasters caused by climate change. These disasters were mostly caused by massive floods, landslides, storm surges, and severe winds brought by typhoons. The destructive weather disturbances are getting more frequent and more extreme, and they are fast becoming the new normal. The business-as-usual approach is no longer sustainable. The government, especially the local governments, must seriously consider the integration of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction and management strategy in all levels of the development planning process. It is an effective tool to reduce the country's vulnerability to natural hazards. Through Administrative Order No. 1, the Philippine government enjoins provincial government units to adopt and use in their planning activities the guidelines on mainstreaming disaster risk reduction in subnational development and land use or physical planning. Crafted by the National Economic and Development Authority or NEDA in partnership with UNDP and European Union, the mainstreaming guidelines promotes multi-hazard and risk-based approach in the preparation of physical and development plans. It also aims to enhance natural disaster risk reduction efforts in the local development planning processes. Included in the guidelines are disaster risk assessment and enhancements in the planning processes to create a sustainable and resilient development, the type of development that ensures the population, economy, and environment are protected against current and future risk. Building on this policy framework, the Climate Change Commission, through its various projects, Project Climate Twin Phoenix, Resilience and Preparedness Toward Inclusive Development or RAPID, Project Rebuild, and Ecotown Framework has introduced new approaches in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in the planning process to be able to anticipate and factor in risks and uncertainties in local development initiatives. The Climate Change Commission brought together different stakeholders working in climate change adaptation or CCA and disaster risk reduction or DRR to come up with a mainstreaming framework that promotes synergies and implementation at the local level. Project Climate Twin Phoenix worked with the Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board to complete the supplemental guidelines on mainstreaming climate and disaster risk in the Comprehensive Land Use Plan or CLUP. These guidelines were approved by the HLURB on February 24, 2014. A milestone project, the guidelines serve as a tool for local government units to help them mainstream CCA-DRR in their local plans. Through cooperative efforts with the University of the Philippines under its DREAM program and Pag-asa, Project Climate Twin Phoenix and Project Rebuild have developed the first ever climate-adjusted flood hazard maps. These maps show how changes in rainfall patterns and predict the depth and geographical extent of floods. The climate-adjusted flood hazard maps looked at flooding with a river basin perspective. They factor in at varying rainfall return periods the changes in water discharge and runoff capacities brought about by the conditions of the land cover of watersheds. The maps provide high-resolution visualization of different flood events including the extent of the flooded area, the estimated depth of floodwaters, and the duration of flooding. LGUs will use the maps when reviewing their current land use strategies and policies and zoning regulations for the purpose of minimizing damage to infrastructure, the number of fatalities, and possible disruption to important socio-economic support facilities. Risk-informed decisions and planning are necessary for decision makers to protect their communities' lives and livelihoods in a changing climate. To address this need, Project Climate Twin Phoenix has developed the Climate and Disaster Exposure Database or Climex.db. As a disaster risk reduction tool, the Climex.db provides georeference data on population, buildings, infrastructure, and economic activities of communities that are considered high risk for flooding and are predisposed to the impacts of climate change. Information gathered can be used as vital inputs to risk and vulnerability assessments. When overlain on existing boundary maps, the climate-adjusted flood hazard maps show which areas are vulnerable as well as the levels of vulnerability due to the impact of climate change. The exposure database gives information on who and what are affected while taking into account the lifespan and evolution of exposed assets in relation to space and time. The Climex.db can be complemented with secondary data information that are useful in mapping critical infrastructures during disasters, such as emergency and lifeline facilities, transportation networks, and other vital services like fire stations, police, and evacuation centers. In assessing one's risk, information and hazard, exposure, and adaptive capacity are all taken into account. Using this formula, Project Rebuild utilized the disaster risk assessment process and integrated the resulting risk estimates to enhance development planning and programming. Project Rebuild created the Climate Disaster Risk Assessment Vulnerability Assessment Manual to guide LGUs in identifying areas at risk to natural hazards. Aside from improving risk awareness, the manual would provide policymakers and risk practitioners information to undertake informed and efficient risk mitigation actions for systematic disaster risk reduction. In the past, the practice of conducting risk assessment looks only at historical events and natural hazards. As a step forward, the CCC, through the Resilience and Preparedness Toward Inclusive Development program, seeks to determine the effects of climate change on the environment by undertaking a Natural Resource Assessment, or NRA. Done as part of disaster and vulnerability risk assessments, the NRA covers upland watersheds down to coastal resources known as the ridge-to-reef approach. In a nutshell, the conduct of the NRA looks at the impact of resources on two fronts: in reducing one's hazard by providing protective services to dissipate the strength of hazards, and in affecting one's vulnerability by providing economic services as source of livelihood, for example, for those exposed to hazards. The NRA, along with Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment, is part of the Ecotown framework being adopted by CCC to localize the National Climate Change Action Plan, or NCCAP. CCC is also partnering with the Department of Interior and Local Government for the formulation of guidelines on mainstreaming climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in the Comprehensive Development Plan by building on the Climate and Disaster Risk Sensitive CLUP, the Natural Resource and Climate Change Vulnerability Assessments, and the DRR-CCA Enhanced Provincial Development Physical Framework Plans. The risk-sensitive CDPs shall ensure that investment programs and budgets of the local governments capture disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation measures. Preparation of CDP is mainly guided by DILG's Memorandum Circular Number 2015-77 that directs all local government units to mainstream climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in their local development planning. By using science-based methodology in analyzing one's vulnerabilities, local government leaders and planners are empowered to prioritize decision areas and identify sectoral development challenges.
In the process of enhancing the mainstreaming framework's risk assessment methodology, the Climate Change Commission came up with different tools: the improved climate exposure database, probabilistic hazard maps, and planning guidelines to support LGUs in integrating DRR and CCA into their local development plans. When confronted with a decision on what to protect, what to adapt to, and what to give up, these tools are useful for decision makers to undertake logical anticipatory actions in planning land use and zoning, in building appropriately hazard-resilient infrastructure, and in making their immediate and natural environments safer and their livelihood and assets better protected. The bottom line is on saving lives. maintaining social cohesion, and shaping mindsets to changes that must be adopted to move forward the agenda for a safer and more resilient Philippines.